Welcome to my cruise pod. I'm Melissa, a university professor who loves to cruise and who loves to talk ship. And boy, today I've got a whole lot of ship to talk. And yeah, it's all about tablecloths. But is it really? Let me give you the tea on Carnival Cruise Line's tablecloth drama, why people are so hot about it, and I'll tell you what I think this signals for the cruise industry as a whole. So let's get into it. First, what's the Carnival tablecloth drama all about? And yeah, you're about to watch a whole video about tablecloths. But as I hinted before, I think there's more here than meets the eye, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let me tell you what we're talking about here. Earlier this year, Carnival made the business decision fleet-wide to eliminate the use of tablecloths in the main dining room, or MDR, and in all the dining areas. Now, this was mostly a quiet move, and frankly, a lot of people, me included, didn't even notice it. In fact, I've sailed Carnival 4 times in the past 6 months and just got off Carnival Freedom a couple of weeks ago. And a few days ago, when this came on my radar, I actually had to think about it and go back and try to remember if we had tablecloths or not. And I even went back and looked at some pictures I took from my cruise a couple weeks ago, which you'll see here. And sure enough, no tablecloths, even on Elegant Night and even in the specialty restaurants like Fahrenheit 555. So I obviously didn't think much about this until a couple of days ago when Carnival Ambassador John Heald posted about it on Facebook. And let me tell you, I was shocked by the passion that this subject of, yes, tablecloths brought out in people. Let me take a moment to explain cruise culture to you because this plays a role in this whole situation. This is especially the case if you're a cruise newbie and you're not familiar with cruise culture. Now, I love cruising. I love cruisers, obviously. But boy, cruise culture, it's something else. It's really interesting from a psychological perspective. Now, don't get me wrong, the majority of cruisers are lovely people. I'd like to think I'm one of them. But I've found that there can be some real toxicity in cruise culture, especially with cruisers that I put in 2 camps. You've got your cruise complainers and the cruise cavalry. Cruise complainers are those that are just never happy. They cruise, but they act like they hate cruising. All they do is complain about it. Nothing ever meets their standards. They're always griping. They're always the ones running to guest services to get tips removed from their bills. You know the type. But on the opposite end of that spectrum, we have the cruise cavalry. These people can be just as toxic. These are those corporate lackeys who are ride or die for their favorite cruise line or cruising in general, and they will jump down the throat of anyone who dares breathe a word of criticism about anything cruising. It's like they consider themselves the cruise line white knights, having to mount their steeds to ride to the defense and rescue of any and all cruise happenings, regardless of if someone has an actual valid complaint about something. Now, I try to foster in my social media platforms a community of that nice middle ground of well-reasoned, rational cruisers who aren't the cruise complainers nonstop whining and being unreasonable, but they also aren't the cavalry either, blindly and ferociously defending their favorite cruise line. Because look, we all have our favorites. Full disclosure, I'm obviously a Carnival girl. I love Carnival, it's my #1 favorite cruise line, but I am more than happy to call them out when they're on some BS. And you can go back and search my videos to find proof of that. But while I love Carnival, I don't feel this manic need to fall on my sword for them and defend them when people talk smack. And people that act like cavalry, it's just weird to me. But I guess that is evidence of the power of brand loyalty. So good job, cruise lines. Carnival's a for-profit company and they're doing quite well. They do not need Melissa riding in their cavalry. And I get it. I see why some people hate Carnival and dog on Carnival. And while I might share my positive experiences with them when I hear negative comments or see these things, I'm not going to try to argue with anyone, tell them they're wrong for thinking what they think about Carnival, and I'm certainly not going to even try to change their mind. So I think the sometimes toxic nature of cruise culture comes into play in this situation, and what caused a little issue about tablecloths to become so impassioned. Now let me take a moment and explain who John Heald is. John is Carnival's brand ambassador, and he's worked for the cruise line for decades, I think like 35 years or something. He's super active on Facebook, and he even has his own fan base. He's an English chap, and he's known and sometimes criticized for his cheeky humor. Now, I've followed John for years. I love this guy. I think he's hilarious. He's the master of the clever clapback. And if you don't follow him, follow him. But I also have mad respect for the stuff that he has to put up with, mostly from the cruise complainers. And I love how he typically handles it. Now, John was getting some heat online about this tablecloth decision, so he made a post about it. I saw that post, read the comments, and I was shocked. I was shocked by the passion that people were so upset about this. And while I'm certainly not cruise cavalry rushing to defend my favorite cruise line, I'll be honest, my immediate first thought was, what's the big deal? I hadn't even noticed it myself. But then I started thinking a little bit more about this issue and kind of psychoanalyzing why people are so upset about this. So I posted the topic on my own community about it. And again, people were really passionate and really divided. And John himself popped in to comment, and I'll share in a moment a bit about what he said. But first, let me tell you the root of what I think is the reason why people are really mad about the tablecloth. And it's not just the tablecloth. Now, I want to take a moment to remind you, I'm an actual university professor. It's not some social media brand or shtick. And specifically, I'm a professor of business. As a consumer, I'm looking at cruising from the lens of business. I'm always thinking in the back of my mind about business stuff. When it comes to cruising, I'm thinking about the operating costs of the sailings, the logistics of the food operations, the intricacies of the cruise workforce, and some labor exploitation, which is a whole other soapbox I don't have time to talk about here. I think about the profit margins, all this stuff. So I think it's the root of the business side that makes this silly little topic and everyone's passion around it so interesting to me. And what I think the issue here is I think it's the boiled frog principle. Now, another similar metaphor you probably heard is death by 1,000 cuts, but I like the frog one better, so we'll roll with that. If you're not familiar with it, the boiled frog principle, it's a metaphor illustrating how gradual, unnoticed changes can lead to disastrous outcomes if they're not addressed. Similar to how a frog is going to slowly boil to death if you place them in water that's heated slowly and gradually. The frog is going to be blissfully unaware, not even notice it. Versus if you boil a pot of water and toss a frog in there, it's going to jump right out. And this is what I see metaphorically happening in the cruise industry. And I think consumers are starting to really recognize it. And I think that is why everyone is in a tizzy about some tablecloths. If you've been cruising for a while, think about it. Since 2020, cruise lines have implemented several cutbacks due to the financial impact of the pandemic. These include reduced staffing levels, scaled back onboard services, like our cabins aren't cleaned twice daily in most cases anymore. There are fewer entertainment options. They've adjusted food offerings. They've cut back on labor. They now charge for room service or charge a room service fee. But while one little cutback might be no big deal, it's that culmination of them, which, might I add, is happening simultaneously with significant spikes in the cost of cruising that has consumers a bit up in arms. It's like cruise consumers are the frog in the pot, slowly being boiled. And as the cruise lines keep cutting back, at what point does the cost of cruising outweigh the benefits of it? Because for me, at least, the huge draw of cruising has always been primarily its affordability and that little taste of luxury. But as the cruise lines are amping up the heat and that water is starting to get pretty darn hot, a lot of cruisers are starting to finally take notice. Now, in my community, one commenter said to another, well, does the lack of a tablecloth make your food taste any less good? And yeah, that's some obvious snark from someone who's acting a little bit like that cruise cavalry group that we talked about, but it's not about the tablecloth. It's not about from going to twice daily turn down service to once a day. It's not about now charging for things that previously were included. It's not about cutting room service or reduced staffing. It's about all of these things in its totality. And that is why cruisers are upset. They're starting to notice the water is boiling. Now let me touch upon another issue at play here, which is a little bit of good old-fashioned corporate greenwashing. Again, I'm going to put on my business professor hat and let you know what this is if you're not familiar with it. Greenwashing is the practice of kind of disingenuously portraying a company or a product as being environmentally friendly when really things are done in the effort of profit margin, and there's really minimal or no real efforts made to improve sustainability. Now, in this case, as I mentioned earlier, John Heald came and commented on my post, and he said, let me quote, "Professor Melissa, respectfully, I hope you will also mention the main reason that we do not have them, tablecloths, that is. And that is washing approximately 3,000 tablecloths every day on every ship and the incredibly negative impact it has on the environment. If luxury is defined by a piece of cloth, then well, I don't quite understand that. And then it goes on to say some other things, which I'll mention in a moment. Now, John is an awesome dude. I love him, I really do. I've followed him for years. I find him hilarious. And you literally could not pay me enough to do his job. It's thankless and it has to be really taxing on his mental health, what he has to deal with. And while I do see the positive environmental impact of this change, I have to look at that as a justification with just a smidge of skepticism. Because, well, this smells a little bit like some corporate greenwashing. Carnival here is framing the removal of white tablecloths in the dining rooms as a move toward being environmentally friendly. And yeah, that may be true. But I think the issue here is that's not really the impetus for this change. It's more about cost cutting and Carnival's bottom line as opposed to genuine environmental concern. And if we want to open that can of worms, let's just say, to put it mildly, cruising isn't exactly environmentally friendly in any way. And as a business professor, I get it. I'm all about the hustle. Good old-fashioned capitalism, baby. And hey, the numbers bear it out. Cruise demand is skyrocketing right now. And that is despite the cuts after cuts after cuts, and despite escalating prices. It's basic supply and demand stuff that I teach in Business 101 to my freshmen, so I get it. I don't blame Carnival for making this change to impact their bottom line. But I think the issue here that's irritating to some people is Carnival doing the greenwashing thing, trying to justify this change like they're doing it because they're stewards of the environment, when it really is about juicing the bottom line. It's like, just be honest about it, or maybe just stay quiet about the change. Just make the change, which apparently happened a while ago, let the complainers grouse about it on the internet and don't even address it. So I guess this brings to light one final point of interest, at least for me, which is, where are we going with the future of cruising? Are the cruise lines going to continue boiling that water? And by that, I mean sneaking in more and more cutbacks. And at what point do cruisers say enough is enough? I'm gonna jump out of this pot before I find myself boiled. Or are we ushering in a new generation of cruisers whose statistics tell us cruisers are getting younger, that don't care about the old ways of cruising, that don't know about the old luxuries? I didn't cruise until 2019, so I never got to experience the real cruise luxuries that I just hear about from the old guard. Elaborate midnight buffets, chocolate fountains, elegant ice sculptures. So I have no comparison point. Because clearly the cutbacks, they're not hurting the cruise lines very much, because we see skyrocketing demand for cruising more than ever. Now, there are other tangential issues here, like brand positioning, and in particular Carnival's brand, and whether moves like this cheapen that brand, which John also addressed in his response to me, saying about Carnival, at no point in our 53 years have we ever labeled ourselves as a luxury cruise line. And point taken, but there's a whole lot of room between luxury and trashy. And as a big Carnival fan, I just worry that the pendulum might be starting to swing a little too close to that trashy side. And with each additional cutback, like removing the tablecloths, it just gets closer and closer. So I have no answers here, just food for thought and fodder for discussion, because I find this stuff obviously really interesting. And no, removal of tablecloths certainly is not going to make the food taste any less good. Although with the cutbacks, it's arguable as to what we consider good in terms of cruise food right now anyway. That's a whole other topic. But rather, the tablecloth kerfluffle is in fact a symptom of a larger problem, and not one that's just specific to Carnival, but the industry as a whole. So what do you think about this surprisingly hot button topic? I want to know. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and while you're at it, like and subscribe. And if you love cruising, check out my blog at profmelissa.com, where I have tons of great free port guides, advice, resources, and more.